Firstly, make sure I have this, sorry, share my screen. There we go. All right. Firstly, I would like to begin by thanking Justin Brown for the Alumni Office and Furman University, and honestly, everyone in the audience that has taken the time to listen to this. I do not take these opportunities lightly, and I'm very grateful. And I just want to say happy Black History Month for that extra day that we have this year. Now, for just disclosure with the images that I'm going to show you, they are not necessarily the families and individuals that I'm talking about, but as someone who is a visual learner, I wanted to show images from people during that period of time to hopefully make these stories a little bit more real. And I want to give credit. Many of the images are coming from the Library of Congress. Okay. Now, on April 8th, 1884, Mary Williamson, the widow of Benjamin Davis, a deceased soldier in the 6th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI, arrived at the Bureau of Pensions local office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Williamson came to provide testimony to a special examiner, who was a white man, regarding the validity of the minor's pension case for her now adult son, Jerome. During the deposition 2 years earlier, the presiding pension agent questioned the legitimacy of Williamson's common law marriage to Benjamin and their child. Now, maybe she had grown tired of having to explain herself to a federal government representative, as she emphasized how the Civil War forever changed their family. Now, I'm going to read a direct quote that's a back and forth between these two individuals, that being Mary and the pension agent. Quote, I kept him, Jerome Davis, until he was 7 or 8 months old, when I took him to his grandfather's at his father's request. And he, his grandfather, has brought him up and took him ever since 1864. What is the reason you do not keep or care for him? Because I had to go to service, and they were willing to care for him. They, the United States Army, drafted men and left me no means of support to work ourselves, end quote. Williamson's statement illustrates, I believe, the harsh reality that she and countless other working poor African American Philadelphians experienced during and long after the Civil War officially ended. Excuse me. Scholarship on United States Colored Troop, or USCT regiments, has long emphasized aspects of military service, such as wartime mobilization, and rightly so, as USCT soldiers sacrificed their lives for the greater good of the United States and for their enslaved brethren. Some soldiers used their service as a direct pathway to demand African American male suffrage. Others served to have their manhood recognized by white society. The lived experiences of working poor Northern USCT families, however, has been largely overlooked. Williamson's testimony, I believe, sheds light on how the war-torn African American Philadelphian husbands from wives, fathers from children, children from parents, and friends from friends. The USCT was pivotal in carrying out the United States military objectives. Yet, the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of able-bodied African American men into the United States military devastated many of these African American families. Some of these families were left to grieve and struggle economically after their male kin died in service. Other families tended to disabilities, physical, emotional, and psychological, of the surviving veterans, while also fighting to stave off fighting their economic issues. Now, I just briefly want to talk about where my work fits into the larger discourse. Now, even with the wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of Black Civil War soldiers. Frederick M. Bender and Dudley Taylor Cornish, for example, published studies that provided overviews on the USCT events. Then in 1965, James McPherson followed suit with an examination on the processes of wartime mobilization and the immediate post-war issues relating to African Americans. Collectively, these studies sought to illuminate what they said was a forgotten past. Quote, the history of the Negro soldier in the Union Army has remained an obscure chapter in American history, end quote, Cornish wrote. For white non-academics and scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but numerous African Americans knew otherwise. During the late 19th and early 20th century, historical analysis of USCT regiments primarily came from African Americans. For example, African American civilian William Wells Brown composed his monograph, The Negro in the American Rebellion, His Heroism and His Fidelity in 1867, after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored the historical significance of USCT regiments when he wrote, quote, I waited patiently before beginning this work, with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand. But up to the present, Brown laments, it has not been done, although many books have been written about the rebellion, end quote. Meanwhile, the literature of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill all investigated the soldiers' wartime sacrifices. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their personal mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, Happy Black History Month, about their wartime exploits. But just as important is the contributions by Susie King Taylor, who was a formerly enslaved woman who became a nurse in the 33rd USCI, and she would later publish her experiences in addition to the post-war struggles that her family experienced. More specifically, that being her husband, Edward, who was also a veteran, who in the his civilian experience was a master carpenter, but wasn't able to resume that work, not due to any disability, solely because of his race. And I'll also say that I have assigned her memoirs in my classes, and students love them. I cannot speak enough to how amazing Susie King Taylor is to American history. Thus, African Americans and some of their white allies fought for inclusion in the historical memory of the Civil War that did not materialize until the modern civil rights movement. Now, 5 of the men that I previously mentioned served in Northern African American regiments. Simmons enlisted in the 41st USCI, Wilson in the 54th Massachusetts, connected to the film Glory, Williams in the 13th USCI, and Newton and Hill both served in the 29th USCI. Afterwards, all of these Black veterans became historians to confront white scholars and non-academics, and even some African Americans who were ignoring their historical significance. Simmons, for example, lamented in 1887 the fact that his students, most likely at Simmons College in Kentucky, knew little about USCT soldiers, when he said, quote, I have noticed in my long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names, end quote. Ultimately, my book, The Family Civil War, builds upon the efforts that these and others started over 130 years ago to uncover the personal histories of USCT soldiers and their extended families as they define them in a manner that brings their experiences and historical importance to the forefront. Now, historians tend to focus on isolated moments of soldiers' experiences, that being the wartime or post-war, to illustrate the hardship that Black soldiers and their blood-related kin experienced. Wartime studies illuminate how racial discrimination in service made the military experience, for African American men dramatically different from all other soldiers. Some scholars detail how white officers readily meted out physical punishments on USCT soldiers who, because of their supposed racial inferiority and untrustworthiness, were thought to have deserved such cruel physical punishments. Meanwhile, Margaret Humphreys argues that due to racially discriminatory policies based on pseudo-racial science, USCT soldiers primarily performed fatigue duty in harsh climates, which led to more deaths from illness and disease than from Confederate weaponry. And we also have veteranhood scholars who stress that white pension agents routinely discriminated against African American Civil War pensioners, primarily on the conviction that they're all liars. I do want to acknowledge the work of historian James G. Mendez, who is the only scholar, other than myself, to place Northern USCT soldiers' families at the center of a book-length study. His book, which I cannot stress enough, is groundbreaking. It's called A Great Sacrifice. It came out in 2020. Again, James G. Mendez. His work focuses on the letters of African American women, specifically mothers, wives, sisters, and family friends connected to the soldiers. Now, in terms of my work, it is well known, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, that the enlistment campaign for Northern African American men in cities such as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that war propagandists, including Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnet, and Anna Dickinson, emphasized the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African American men had to emancipate their enslaved Southern brethren. Enlistment rhetoric claimed that demonstrating one's patriotic manhood would allow them to acquire full citizenship rights, including voting rights, possibly. War propagandists collectively recognized that all USCT soldiers would experience, unfortunately, racial discrimination in service. And for those who are interested, on the top left of the screen, that is a picture of Henry Highland Garnet, Reverend Henry Highland Garnet, who was actually the first chaplain for the 20th United States Colored Infantry. If you've ever seen the film Gangs of New York, actually where the film ends, a few months, 7 months afterwards, will be one of the first Black regiments to march down on northern streets. And he will be a part of that in addition to the work of his wife, Julia, who did phenomenal ways to support Black soldiers in New York State. And I've previously written on both of them. Even so, potential USCT recruits were told to focus on ending slavery while simultaneously proving that African American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, war propagandists believed that it could lead to USCT soldiers and African Americans possibly attaining post-war rights, such as suffrage rights, sadly only for men, and the protection of their civil rights, though while refuting negative racial stereotypes through military service. Unfortunately, for many of these families, wartime mobilization ignored their dire economic situations that they experienced every day in society. And the removal of able-bodied African American men hindered an ongoing economic crisis for these working poor Philadelphian families who were already struggling due to racial discrimination that impacted their lives. And in some cases, their financial woes continued generations after the Civil War officially ended. Now, military service did not exist in isolated segments of a soldier's life. Although different from soldiers on the front lines, the families of USCT soldiers also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in very few ways that anyone, including the soldiers, could have ever anticipated. Now, the notion that serving in a USCT regiment would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society, though it could only occur if African American men became soldiers and defenders for a nation that legalized slavery and the oppression of any Black person within its borders, and ignored the fact that these men would have to sacrifice their lives in the process. Nor was there any recognition in many cases of how the recruits' families would be directly impacted. At the same time, surviving the war did not necessarily improve the socioeconomic standing for many of the families that I studied in the book. Now, the big question that always gets asked, and it's a fair one, why Philadelphia? Well, if I'm being honest, part of it was I have family in that area, and I was very curious to see if I have any ties to this, especially because of the military service connections on my mother's side. But the other reason is for these points that I lay out here. Philadelphia is the ideal location to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisan and racial politics where racial violence, including large-scale race riots, were commonplace throughout the 19th century. For example, the image that you see on the left side of your screen is the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, which was supposed to be this abolitionist think tank. If I'm remembering the event correctly, the building did not last more than a week or less than, about 3 to 4 days in full operation. The short version of what you see here, if you were to rewind the clock maybe a few hours, what kicked that event off was unfortunately was the anti-abolitionist rhetoric, and they were so disturbed seeing Black and white women marching arm in arm in solidarity, challenging slavery. The end result is the burning of that building. Wait, I'm sorry. They then turned their attention to burning Black churches, Black schools, Black businesses, and for context, one of the first churches for African Americans is in Philadelphia. The image that you see on the right side of the screen, I believe, is a depiction of what was called the Flying Horses Riot. The short version of what that event connected to was Black and white children essentially arguing over who gets the ride on the carousel. In the aftermath of that dispute, this is what you see. But that's not the end result, because in the aftermath, they turned to burning Black churches, Black buildings, and attacking Black people. There were race massacres or large-scale racial violence, I believe 1834, 1838, 1842, and around 1876 or 1877, just so you understand the normalcy of anti-Blackness in a supposed free city and free state. It also had one of the most significant free Northern African American populations in 1860 with over 22,000, which was about 4% of the city's total population at that time. It also had the who's who of abolitionists that included people such as Lucretia Mott and Octavius Cotto, which I believe make it the ideal location. Now, for this first book, I focused on the first three regiments, that being the 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th USCI, which all trained in Philadelphia, where the majority of the recruiting took place for the entire state. In essence, Civil War military service was inescapable for any Philadelphian by 1863, as the militarization of the city and its populace pressed onward to support the war effort. However, many people advocating for African American men to enlist in the United States Army seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all local African Americans, due to racial discrimination in every facet of Northern society, live through every day of their lives as they battled for their survival, literally and economically. So in terms of the total number of individuals that I studied for this book, firstly, it's 185 Philadelphian native-born men who were enlisted in one of these first three Pennsylvania USCT regiments, to be clear. That number does not even comprise 1% of the city's total African-American population. And since each regiment usually caps at about 1,000 enlisted men, the soldiers that I investigate encompasses about 6% of the collective regiment's population. But to be clear, regardless of their small proportion, every one of their lives mattered. Moreover, these men were never merely cannon fodder, military laborers, or emancipators. These were fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, and friends to a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, including children, and sometimes future USCT soldiers, had to contribute to their family's household finances in order to stave off poverty, if only temporarily. Now, while I said that this study was looking at 185 of these soldiers, they were actually the starting point. In reality, I wanted to understand the people that was connected to them, whether that being their mother, their grandparents, their great-grandchildren. And to be honest, that's because I am the child of service members, and I wanted to tell the stories that I've heard, not just of my own, of others. So for this book, it is not just 185 soldiers. It actually is 1,000 individuals in these multi-generational families to highlight how they experienced the long-term financial ramifications of Civil War military service. Now, due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and racially discriminatory practices throughout the Civil War pension application process for both an invalid, which was a veteran, or a dependent, collectively jeopardized the finances of many of these working poor Philadelphian families. And these effects were felt far beyond any degree that the United States government, war propagandists, or even the soldiers themselves could have ever understood. Excuse me. So I'm happy to talk about, if anyone is interested, the primary sources that I used to do this work. The short version is Civil War pension records, which most times you can find in DC at the National Archives. I will say this, they're absolutely amazing. You really never know what's going to be in those records. And even the archivist will tell you that. For example, when I was doing my research for this book, I found in one of the archives a letter from the desk of Eleanor Roosevelt while she was the First Lady during the height of the Great Depression. And I was shaking because it was a correspondence from the daughter of a USCT veteran who essentially was beseeching the First Lady to remember what their family gave to the United States of America. And I won't spoil it on the off chance that you all want to check this book out, which is also available at Furman's library, but I'll just say this. The First Lady responds to this woman who she's never met in person in less than 3 days. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And I say again that you never know what's going to be in those pension records. Compiled military service records, which are also a gold mine, those are accessible through ancestry.com. I looked at regimental books, the published memoirs, not just of my regiments, but also of those even in Massachusetts, city directories, and then the federal census. If I'm being honest, the federal census has probably been one of the best sources to find out the lives of these people. That's how I was able to find out the mothers, the sisters, the grandmothers, the grandchildren, because the pension records usually was only the soldier giving testimony about their experiences. But I wanted to know whom they were living with. What were their parents' occupations? Did they even live with their parents? That information was found in the federal census. I will say for those who are interested in looking at those records, They get much more detailed after 1880. Pre-1880, they're not as nuanced in the information they give. I also looked at public speeches by prominent individuals, and that being also the Union League Club's organizational records and newspapers, white and African American. Specifically for African American newspapers, one is the Weekly Anglo-African, which published out of New York City, New York, and then the Christian Recorder, which is tied to the African Methodist Episcopal Church and is one of the most important records that I've ever used because those are where soldiers wrote about their experiences all the time. So if you really want to get a window into what Black soldiers were talking about when they came into states like South Carolina, and I will say this for those in the audience that are interested, even though the book was about Black Philadelphians, they come into, for example, South Carolina. They're in Beaufort. They're in Florida. They're actually part of, in Texas, Juneteenth. And the thing is, if you look at the newspapers, they're not actually talking about Juneteenth the way we do. What they're talking about is, why are we in Texas? Why am I not home? I miss my child. We won the war. I was at Appomattox. What am I doing worrying about a supposed French invasion from Mexico, like through Mexico, which is why they were there. That's why I would say is these are gold mines in terms of records. Now, with the last bit of time, I want to give one of the examples of many just to hopefully make this a little bit more real. In 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. Sarah, for undisclosed reasons, became a single mother, raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself until she married James Reeves on an undisclosed date. In total, the couple would raise 7 children, which created an a significant economic burden on the entire family, as James was the only documented full-time wage earner working as a laborer, which was unfortunately very common for African Americans due to racial and gender discrimination. Now, perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising their kids at home, which many Black women did. For those who are interested, Jane E. Dabble, Dabel, has written a book called A Respectable Woman. I cannot stress that book enough. It does an exceptional job highlighting those topics. Now, none of the 7 children attended school when they were school age. Their absences from school were not unique, as many other working poor African American Philadelphian families chose not to send their children to racially segregated schools that were inferior in nearly every manner to their white counterparts, such as having unqualified and openly racist teachers and also dealing with funding issues. Other families needed their children to forego receiving a formal education and required these children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to find wage earning employment, even temporarily, to supplement their household income. Now, it is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences, which illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. Now, for Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after his stepfather was no longer able to perform his duties as a laborer after he incurred a ruptured hernia and rheumatism due to an exposure while working. Andrew was able to work as a farm laborer, earning $8 per month. That number is important. $8 per month as a civilian. The majority of his wages went to help his parents and siblings survive, as he was the only documented full-time wage earner in their home. Andrew's familial obligations were well known among the members of his local community. Jason Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew, later testified that he was the crucial provider to the entire family after his stepfather's afflictions materialized. As a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as the breadwinner, even though he lived with his stepfather in the same home. Perhaps this gave Andrew a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more to Andrew was keeping his family economically stable through his labor, which meant that material realities for this particular working poor family were starkly different from Victorian era gender roles. Eventually, Andrew answered the United States mobilizing call to arms, and he enlisted on August 12th of 1863, joining the 6th USCI. So for those who are interested, the image on the left is actually Camp William Penn. That is one of the largest U.S. military bases during the Civil War. They will actually train 11 different Black regiments designated to the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to be doing my next book is going to focus on that camp itself because there's also a direct connection to Lucretia Mott because her family donated the land for that space. In addition to that, she made it her personal mission to go there regularly to support African Americans to do their part to end slavery and to win the Civil War. And we need to, in society, put more respect on Lucretia Mott's connections to the USCT. The image on the right is the regimental flag for the 6th USCI. Now, that one is one I believe that Black women from Philadelphia actually helped to raise the money for. And if I'm remembering the individual, I think it was David B. Bowser. He was the one who created it. In fact, I've written about many instances where Black women, not just in Pennsylvania, but in New York State, in Massachusetts, and also, as others have noted, in Iowa, Black women did this a lot. And we need to put more respect on their important contributions to winning the Civil War. Now, turning back to Andrew. Records do not reveal what Andrew's motivations were for serving the military. However, it is clear that his decision to fight created an immediate problem for his entire family, as they did not receive his $100 federal enlistment bounty, as the payment would only occur after his service ended. And essentially, the short version is his family, really everyone by 1863, is being punished for what were called bounty jumpers, where white men in both armies were essentially registering under fake names to collect these massive payouts, one lump sums, then going somewhere else and doing the same. So in order to rectify the issue, the US military basically said, in many instances, you would not get the money until the end of the service, if you survive. Now, the Reeves family was now without their breadwinner, and it meant that their finances became extremely chaotic as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familiar responsibilities. Now, serving in the U.S. Army did not cease Andrew from seeking to maintain a close relationship to his family back home. On March 25th of 1864, Andrew wrote Sarah and informed him of his time near camp at Yorktown, Virginia. In the letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family on the home front that he missed dearly. Andrew then complained about his financial woes, which were making it harder for him to communicate with him. And he said, quote, "Dear mother, I hope you do not think hard of me for not writing you any sooner. I could not get paper to write you any sooner because paper is very hard to get here without any money." End quote. Excuse me. Perhaps his complaint was about his inability to afford paper was due to the inefficiency of military paymasters who rarely paid any soldier in either military in a timely fashion. In fact, one of my favorite jokes that I think William Marvel has written about, historian, is that soldiers often said the most hated person in the camp was the paymaster when they didn't have money, but the most loved person in the camp was the paymaster when they had money. Turning back to Andrew, he then beseeched his mother to write him so that he could remain updated on how his family was doing in his absence. And it is feasible that Andrew's request was his way of recognizing how his military service jeopardized the finances of his kin. Now, in that same letter, Andrew also noted that armed combat was a defining component of military service, and without it, he felt incomplete. Quote, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up," end quote. Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederate soldiers were, in his opinion, void of masculine patriotic honor due to their unwillingness to engage in armed combat. Maybe his family took pride in the confidence and bravery that Andrew showed, but it also meant that he pined to sacrifice his life. Now, full disclosure, this image is actually of the Battle of Olustee in the state of Florida, and is, I believe, one of the bloodiest battles that Black soldiers in the Civil War took part in. For those who are interested, Dr. Barbara Gannon at the University of Central Florida is doing some very important work to get that site recognized by the national government, because right now it's just an open field where there are Black and white soldiers from the United States and the Confederacy that are just in this field. And there's a lot of problems with that. So for those who are interested, again, Dr. Barbara Gannon. Now, unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true as he received an injury on June 30th of 1864 at the Battle of Point of Rock in Virginia. He would later die from those injuries. Once the news came home, his mother applied for what was called a mother's pension in the hopes of receiving some financial compensation for her son's death. Now, she was only qualified because Andrew had died a bachelor. Otherwise, she would have been ineligible. None of his siblings were eligible because they were neither the wife or the offspring. His stepfather, for unknown reasons, did not apply for a pension, though technically he could have. Now, Sarah had her application approved, and she collected Andrew's $100 enlistment bounty and a pension of $8 per month that began in 1864 and she would continue earning for the remainder of her life. In 1886, her pension reached $12 per month. In 1896, it rose to $33 per month. Now, to be clear, as historian Larry Logue has argued, pensions were meant to only supplement an individual's income and not an entire family. Meanwhile, members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that throughout the late 19th century, that Sarah frequently depended on the kindness of her neighbors to survive. Quote, she is a widow, over 70 years of age, and quite decrepit. She has been supported on the charitable people of her neighborhood, end quote. Additionally, Sarah resorted to selling candies and cakes to bolster her finances whenever possible. And since Sarah was the only documented individual in her household receiving money, it is feasible that it was rarely, if ever, enough to provide fiscal stability for their entire family. Now, becoming a pensioner did not stop federal government representatives from investigating the private life of Sarah or any African American applicant. Shortly after James died of pneumonia in 1886, pension agents began an invasive examination of his employment and disability history to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she had been defrauding the federal government all along. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Multiple childhood friends of Andrew, meanwhile, confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for their entire family, which confirmed Sarah's financial dependency on her son. After the intrusive inquiry by the federal government, Sarah's pension continued. But it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease their skepticism. In the end, Andrew continued contributing to his family, even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation for his passing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holly, for that presentation, and definitely information I'm sure a lot of us didn't know. I did have one question come in to me, and we'll open this time will be for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to insert them into the Q&A group, or as I said, I've received one question through direct chat. What was the biggest revelation or surprise from the research you did for this book?
Okay, that's a great question. The biggest one, actually, years ago, right, way when I was a grad student, I always dreamed that I would have the opportunity to get the approval of a family member, right? Because I take very seriously what I do. And the short version of the story is I did an event like this, actually. And I got an email from someone who turned out is the direct descendant of one of the people that I've written about. And I pleaded with her to read the book and give me her honest assessment. And I'm not going to read the email because it'll get me super emotional, but it was basically that they said, thank you for not only acknowledging my great, great, great like uncle, but that you did justice to the women in these families too. And that thank you for telling the stories that need to be told. So it's like, for me, it's that they'll empower Black people, right? To know like our history is important. And I've told the descendant, like, to me, we need to put more respect in your family, help save this country. End of story.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, since then, or maybe even in your research, were you able to, utilize information from families, or was that kind of post writing the book and allowing them to read? And then even beyond that, has there been any kind of communication between you and them, maybe wanting you? I know sometimes in these things, they may want you to go even further, right, and find out more and do more. Has there been any of that between you and the families?
Yeah, I literally got an email like that earlier today. I think that's something I'm struggling with right now. Is just like, I understand and respect what, the excitement that people have, like, you should do this project. And it's hard, right? Because I want to do these projects, but I want to do them with justice. So I think for me, and I'll say this to the audience, excuse me, if you turn to the back of the book, I actually have the methods because I want people to know how to find themselves. So I would say that's what I try to tell a lot of the different descendants that have reached out to me is that it's not, it is easier than one thinks to do a lot of this work, especially because all you really need access to is the public library, for example, right? Or Furman's lab, basically a library to get the materials sent to you in theory. But I would also say for me, I mean, I have three other books in the back of my head. It's just getting the time, especially with the baby, to make them all succeed. But I will say that these kind of events are like reinvigorate, right? Because it's one thing to do this work, and I'll say this to the audience, because this is, I think, important to the story. When I submitted this book, like as a draft, I was literally told by an individual, a scholar, then who cares about Black people's like this story? We've heard this before. Boo hoo. And for me, like I never forgot that disrespect of these people's stories, of these people's lives, especially since descendants, some of them, not all, have said to me, like, thank you for saying out loud, we've had to say privately. And so if I can use this platform, this moment to tell any descendant, not just descendants that I'm read about, you matter. Please hear me when I say that.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned writing your next book on the camp. I can't remember the name of it, but you mentioned writing that. So I'm curious: will there be some kind of intersection between this and that? Is this a completely new process, a new book, new topic? And then even like your research in that. What's that process like in getting that down to paper to get published?
I wish some of my FYW students were in the room for what I'm about to say. um, I would say that, and I said this recently to some of them, I let the records tell me where to go. So here, and I say this to the audience. When I pitched this project a long time ago, I pitched a project of Black soldiers talking about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, Juneteenth. What they talked about in the records was unemployment, various disabilities, the demands to be remembered, to not be forgotten, to get a military funeral, right? And so like that really pushed me to like hear what Black people were saying to the federal government, especially, and that we define our families in these ways. And I'll say, and this is how it connects to the Camp William Penn book. During the research for this first book, I started to find these records of Black civilians getting married at this camp. And then all these military policies seeking to ban Black women from coming to the camp to support the soldiers. And I was thinking to myself, as someone who's lived on multiple military bases, I need to put more respect on how they're doing it well before I did it in the 1980s. So I think it's like this is in many ways is an extension of the first book. I would say the bigger argument for this newer book is going to be how Black Pennsylvanians, through military service, demand inclusion into the United States family. They've always felt that way, right? But it's that United States refused to acknowledge their humanity, their citizenship, and all these dynamics. But through military service and this camp, they refuse to leave. And so much so they're literally creating new families in the space, which I still can't understand why they did that. I mean, why the military allowed them to.
No, man, that's very interesting. Looking forward to the next book. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Obviously, a ton of things going on as we conclude Black History Month, and just sharing your passion and from your heart, man. It's something I'm sure it took a lot of time and energy to do. So we are grateful for you. And if no other questions, that will conclude our program for tonight. And Dr. Holly, again, we thank you, and thank you everybody for joining in. And we look forward to the next one. Have a good evening.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night.